Hello and welcome to another episode of a Wicked Parley. Tonight we're going to be discussing how to communicate despite disagreeing with one another. And before we really even get started into that particular episode, I want to kind of let everyone know that next week we're going to be doing a special call-in show. This show is going to basically happen via Discord, so please join our Discord server. And if you're interested in being a caller on that particular show, please, basically join us for that. And, say hello and ask questions and anything like that. We'll be discussing anything you guys want to talk about. So if you come in, you call in via that particular thing on Discord, then basically have your question ready or your topic, and we'll just kind of discuss it. And after we're done discussing the particular topic or question, we'll be just kind of moving on to the next caller and kind of getting through that until we've gotten through everybody. So hopefully you guys come check it out. It's going to be kind of experimental. It's kind of the first time we're ever going to do something like this. So hopefully it turns out good. If it doesn't, please, God, be understanding.
Decent.
Yeah.
Please and thank you.
Yes. All right. So without further ado, let's go ahead and jump into tonight's episode. Now, I'm pretty sure every single person has gotten into a disagreement one way or another. Yeah, there have been times where people will, be just at, ready to have fisticuffs when they interact with anybody. And I think it's kind of important to know how to communicate even when what the person you're communicating with says something you don't like or disagree with.
You're the stereotypical cat dog now.
Oh, yeah, definitely. There's the cat-dog dynamic. It's very, very self-evident. All right, so one of the big things in which I think is kind of helpful to understand when it comes to trying to communicate with someone, especially when you disagree, has to do with a technique that is very common to some, but I kind of want to run through it anyways, and that is the idea of finding common ground. One of the easiest ways of, finding common ground typically is looking into what the person's ideals are and trying to see where you're similar, where do your thoughts align. This has a whole bunch of benefits. This can help prevent rejection. It can prevent demonization and other forms of stigmatization. It can also help you better understand where the person you're having this disagreement with is coming from. Because it is entirely possible that your perception of what's going on in the conversation might be inaccurate. And I think one of the best things you can do to convey and communicate any idea with someone is to be prepared to be wrong. That it's okay to be wrong. And being open to that is critical when it comes to, being able to have a productive and fruitful conversation. So, with that being said, I want to also discuss a few of the things that happen when perhaps you have some sort of discussion and it starts to go wrong and you're trying to find common ground and, maybe it's not working super well. Well, one of those particular things that you can try to do is you can try to shift the topic temporarily to a subject that isn't so contentious. Often people who are in disagreements are usually they're in a shouting match most of the time. Most people are just they get angry at each other and they're raising their voice. They're doing all sorts of, gestures, and it doesn't really convey the level of communication that's required to really mediate and come to a peaceful conclusion if you're raising your voice at the same time they are.
Question.
Yeah.
When you say temporarily move the conversation to a, less heated topic, does this include small talk or is that a completely different thing?
I mean, you could, depending on the person. I think it's highly determined based upon who's having the interaction. If, for instance, this is a person that you're friends with, maybe it's a colleague, then perhaps you could do small talk, especially if it's in an office setting or like a work environment where you can sort of break the ice of the contentious issue with something else that both are mutually going to have experienced that perhaps they also either disagree with or agree with, and finding some sort of camaraderie, or like we were mentioning before, finding common ground. This particular technique can be quite helpful because it can kind of turn a person's perspective to your own and vice versa. And that way you get that clear line of sight on the issue.
Okay.
Yeah. I think another thing to consider also is the way in which you present an issue. I myself make this mistake all the time, but when I convey thoughts and opinions, often I'm not considering the tone of voice that I use with various people. I make a really common mistake of just assuming automatically that everybody that I interact with understands who I am, where I'm coming from at all times. This is a very big no-no when it comes to communication. Something that I personally have to work on very much in the near future.
Hard same. Hard same.
Yeah. And if you're aware of this, then it allows you at least the ability to work on it. And so definitely if you ever find, anyone in the audience finds himself in this particular circumstance, this situation, it can be really helpful to just stop, pause, take a moment, and then be sure that what you're saying is what you're trying to say, and you're saying in the correct volume, the correct tone, and all your body language is saying the same thing. Because, I mean, the worst thing you can do is send a mixed signal to someone where perhaps you're shouting, but you're shouting in a way that is perhaps a little on the aggressive side, but your message is positive and your body language is either neutral or aggressive. It can send all sorts of things in the wrong direction, something you should probably avoid. I'm wondering, anyone in the chat, any of you guys experienced anything like this? Is this something that you can definitely go, hey, this has happened to me before. I know that this is. Yeah, and feel free to send it in the chat. Okay, so I kind of want to discuss just a little bit about some of the problems, particularly when it comes to communication, and some of the things that you can potentially avoid, like you're going to probably do, and ways of kind of moving past it, being able to give yourself some tips, some things to follow. So one of the biggest no-nos when it comes to communication is avoiding eye contact. I know, me, I have access to a camera. You could see my ugly mug if you wanted to, but I don't. I have it turned off. So I clearly also not doing a good job in this particular regard. But eye contact is critical when it comes to being able to convey ideas, because eye contact is something that we as humans do to gain trust, to do and connect with various people in a whole extra series of ways that doesn't necessarily have to do with verbal communication. So, one of the things that often happens, when you have a conversation is that a lot of times you'll just kind of like look off into space. And so this is kind of where the whole eye contact kind of comes from. And as a tip for anyone who may have problems with this particular thing, it can kind of be helpful to just kind of like pick a feature on someone and just kind of look in that general direction. That way they have the idea that perhaps you're attempting to make eye contact. So sometimes you can look at a forehead or a nose, or maybe they have a really big mole. I don't know.
Why that last one?
I don't know, because it's funny. I don't know. I've watched way too much Austin Powers. Mole.
All right.
That's probably where it comes from. But anyways, I see Kyle has a message.
Yeah. Kyle says when they have disagreements with people, they find that the person they're talking to gets incredibly irritated. When they try giving them emotional air and to give them understanding, it all of a sudden becomes a therapy session.
Yes. I have encountered something similar. Yeah, honestly, communication with people can be quite difficult because not everyone's obviously going to be the same. I always think of having people being equipped with a variety of different tools to work with, and then kind of it's a trial by error kind of situation more often than not.
Many errors.
Yeah. So the more that you know a person, the more easy it is to go and find the correct tool for the given situation. But if it's a person you don't know, and you have a disagreement with, there are some things you can try to consider that make it not a therapy session. Most of the time people will kind of, at least in my experience, have kind of looked at the way in which I speak and the fact that I kind of speak with authority and I speak with knowledge, and I use kind of like big words to describe certain things. And so this way it gives me kind of an air of I know what I'm talking about, and it kind of turns into a therapy session because they trust that what I have to say is important and accurate. If you want to avoid that particular circumstance, you might want to try using smaller words, having a honest conversation. Don't be dishonest, but consider perhaps using certain smaller phrases and less educationally driven lingo to communicate and convey thoughts. This way, they're not going to think that you're superior to them, and therefore they won't try to come at you with a therapy angle. They might just kind of come at you at the same level. One of the biggest things that I've learned when it comes to practicing like therapy stuff in general has to do with the idea of always coming down to the level of people in general. And I find that not just in therapy, but just in any form of communication, being able to be reciprocal to the specific needs and the type of energy that a person kind of comes at you is really important in having clear communication. Because you don't want to be shouting or whispering to someone who is not doing such. Not to say that you should be shouting back at someone who's shouting, but no RAR. But definitely meeting them at their level is a good way of kind of breaking the ice, and it kind of circles back to that whole finding common ground. So hopefully that helps. I'm not sure, but yeah, let me know if you give it a try sometime and see if it works. All right. So when it comes down to talking about basically eye contact and kind of like picking a feature and focusing on it, there are some reasons why eye contact is kind of important. A lot of researchers have discussed the fact that a lot of people actually find eye contact a great way to build respect. It also showcases a type of openness that usually leads to honesty. It kind of creates bonds with people, and it really helps people become more self-aware. And if you're looking for a relationship, it can create attraction because some people are drawn to people's eyes. So, I definitely think that like understanding how you communicate and how you do things is super, super important. And it's super important because all these disagreements and arguments that people often have on Twitter, I think are usually fostered because they fundamentally lack key elements of conversations. There's a guy that discusses at decent length the idea of the elements of personal communication. The guy's name is Dr. Albert. His last name is very long, so I'm going to probably slay this and just do it terribly, but I believe it's called Maharam. But I'm totally probably mispronouncing it. He talks about the 7-38-55 rule, which has to do with the elements of personal communication. The idea being that 7% of communication is spoken word, 38% is voice tones, and 55% is body language. Now, this type of breakdown is not 100% perfect, if I'm going to be honest with you, because it kind of leaves out a few other forms of communication that I'm sure we're all pretty much aware of at this point. If you've used a phone, text messages is a thing. And so with the combination of emojis that are used in text, it kind of conveys an in-between of tone and spoken word, but like in a written format. And in some ways, you could say that memes and other things can convey body language. So you could say there's kind of this weird middle ground when it comes to certain types of written messages or digital messages that kind of transcends these percentages. But
I've seen challenges where people try to communicate only through memes.
Oh yeah, how accurate are they?
Some of them are actually pretty accurate. It's like scary.
Is it really?
Yeah, so like I've seen a list of just nothing but memes, and I was still able to follow it, like what was happening, and I'm like, I'm terrified, but at the same time impressed.
Well, I mean that makes sense. I mean, when it comes down to body language, according to Dr. Albert, his percentage is 55% of what you communicate is going to be body language, which means that you have a 50-50 chance if you can read the body language of the person of pretty much getting it right, a little bit better than 50%. So, I mean, in that particular way, it kind of makes sense that you could kind of do that with memes, maybe, if you can kind of like infer memes as body language, but I mean,
Maybe.
Yeah. I think that like digital forms of messaging is not considered part of this. I think it's more of like an undirectly spoken thing, and so it kind of is a little bit weird. But I think that it could be potentially looked at. Perhaps someone will do a thesis on on that someday, and we'll be able to get a more concrete answer data-wise. But yeah, okay, so I see that we got a couple messages. You want to go ahead and read them?
Was also responding. All right. So the question I posed to the chat was, what do you do when you get into a disagreement?
Mm-hmm.
So Kyle states that they would try to understand the other person and make sure that they understand their position. Then if they agree, they tell them. If they disagree, they're still working on telling people that they disagree. Okay. Which, you know what, fair. Sometimes it might be difficult, especially if they don't accept it peacefully, of all things.
Mm-hmm.
I hate the screaming matches just because I don't agree with them.
Yeah, I mean, all too often people do, have difficulty conveying a disagreement. It usually takes a person who's extremely assertive and someone who is, like, we'll say, a little more reckless than the average person to be able to voice a disagreement. So, Kyle, don't feel bad about having a little bit of trouble telling people you disagree. But know that, like, if you ever want to disagree with anything said on the show, it's a safe space to do so.
Yeah.
But,
and host also had a response.
Okay.
They said that they tried to reach an understanding. The most disagreement they get into involves some form of information being confused.
That makes sense.
Sometimes, depending on the person, I feel like being in a state of confusion is safer for whatever reason.
I think that it depends on the circumstance. I mean, for instance, if you were trying to be confused and you're working as, I don't know, like an air traffic controller, I feel like that would have disastrous results.
Yeah, so it just, like, depends on person, depends on circumstance. But it's just like, if the person was just going to back off just because you're confused, I'd rather do that sometimes.
Yeah, I think, like, the thing is that, like, it boils down, whenever you get into a confrontation like that, right?
Yeah.
It primarily comes down to who is more agreeable than the other.
Mm.
If a person is less agreeable, that person is more likely to probably get their way in any conversation. And the person who's more agreeable is more likely to go along with whatever the other person says. And so, like, if you kind of go with the flow and you don't make waves, then perhaps you won't have as much controversy, but you also won't necessarily have as much control in your life. So, I mean, like, when it comes down to those particular things, I guess it all boils down to what you care about. If you're trying to convey and communicate information and you're not being heard, then do you find it being living life more contently by not being in a situation where you're constantly at odds with people? Or do you want to have your voice heard and demand that people at least understand your side of things? And even if it means that your life is miserable. So, yeah, definitely that is a funny meme that I 100% agree with. I think everyone needs to work on communication skills. Everybody. But, yeah, okay, so when it comes to discussing some of the other things, I think it's also kind of important to kind of discuss what some of the problems and the common things that can occur when you perhaps... do a certain, we'll say, not positive way of expressing oneself in a communication.
Uh-oh.
Yeah. So, I'm pretty sure everyone's been interrupted during a conversation while making a counterpoint.
Yes.
Shocking. I almost wonder, who could potentially be doing that.
Absolutely. Every freaking week.
Yeah, I never do that. I know what you're talking about. It's never happened. Not even once. Of course it has. I'm so mad. I'm sorry.
So mad. So irritating. No, I'm joking.
Oh, no.
Absolutely done. Anyway.
All right. Yeah,
like, it's a form of good communication if you can joke about it, at least. It's when you can't joke about it later that...
I'm so serious right now. I don't even care. How dare you accuse me of such things? Oh my god, I'm just done.
Oh no, what am I going to do?
Honestly, interruptions happen all the time for a variety of reasons. It shouldn't be something that you should necessarily get in the way of communication. You just need to make sure that when you do that, you make an attempt to apologize and to try and correct future forms of the behavior. It's impossible to 100% alleviate this particular circumstance because often it occurs because of technology. Someone could be on a phone and like the phone signal is not working 100%, and so you're kind of pseudo cutting in and out, and so you might inadvertently be cutting off someone in the middle of their talking because your phone didn't work good.
Don't talk to me about the voice lag and Zoom calls or Discord calls or just any sort of online computer call.
Yeah, I know. It's pretty bad. It's pretty bad. I mean, just for like communication's sake, right? I mean, I'm pretty sure at least some of us have watched the last presidential debate. And did anyone catch how many times that Trump interrupted Biden? Like, did anyone keep track?
No, but I'm gonna guess triple digit.
Oh my God, it was a lot. I genuinely don't know, but it was literally an interruption every few seconds. So it was ridiculous. So like that is a master class in this is not how you communicate, and this is what interruption looks like. So, anyways, another thing that people often use, which is less, mean, has to do with the way in which people use using a verbal placeholder in a conversation. A verbal placeholder in a conversation can typically look like something like whatchamacallit, or it can sort of be a way of pursuing a specific counterpoint when you don't know all the details in a conversation. And those particular things can be distracting and can really create misinformation, which of course can create fighting and further spur disagreements. And if you're doing any of these particular things, then the credibility of whatever you're trying to convey falls apart. So, don't do that. All right, I'm gonna do one more negative real quick, just so that way,
sure. Let's go.
that way we can kind of like get through this just a tad bit.
Let's go.
The worst thing I think that every person probably does when it comes to communication has to do with gossiping. Now, everyone that I have ever met has talked shit about somebody at some point in their life. Mm-hmm. Some people have spread information around. The problem with gossiping, in my particular opinion, is this. If it's not true, then it can do large amounts of damage. If something is true, then eventually it's just going to come out no matter what. And so, to me, at the very least, it's something that we definitely need to kind of curb. It's not something we can ever stop because, frankly speaking, gossiping is part of communicating. It's just something that happens. And it's a way of some people pass the time. So, like, it's important to make sure that whatever you are gossiping about is factual and that you're not spreading misinformation and rumor. Because if you have a disagreement with somebody and they bring up something like that came from gossip, then once again, this is kind of like the whole, if it's not 100%, then it can kind of erode what you're trying to say. And if it erodes what you're trying to say, then how are you ever going to come to terms with the other person? So, yeah. Okay. I see Kyle made a statement.
Mm-hmm. I asked another question in the chat about what is your biggest pet peeve about communication with other people? Because some people are going to have more pet peeves than others. Kyle responded that their biggest pet peeve is when they are asked, "Am I wrong?" as a rhetorical question. Gosh, I have heard that. I have come up with something that will absolutely throw them to the point where, so it's like, am I wrong? I will just say yes, even if they are right, because they didn't tell me to mean it. It will throw them off and make them have to include the whole "and mean it" phrase whenever they ask me, which just makes me laugh because I influenced the conversation that hard.
Well, that's certainly something I can see. I have to agree with you, Kyle. It is a pretty big pet peeve of mine because it doesn't really infer knowledge. It just forces a blind obedience, which to me, unless you are 100% on board, it feels degrading. And on top of that, like, if they have to say that, then they're probably not in agreement with what you're trying to say.
Yeah, I made a mention in the chat. Like, to me, it sounds like a way to bring up their ego.
Yeah. I mean, am I wrong?
Yes.
Okay. All right. Okay, so I think the next thing has to do when it comes to communicating, especially when you disagree, is being able to express strong counterpoints at strategically optimal times. This, to me, is one of the most fundamental things that so many people struggle with. Because I've seen plenty of people who are quite intelligent have discussions that lead into massive disagreements because somebody chose to say the correct thing at the wrong time, or something that was totally incorrect at just the right time, and it created just enough confusion to spur the disagreement on or conversation in a very negative trajectory. So when it comes to this, there's a few different ways in which you can kind of handle it. But before we do, is there something you got to say, Rose?
No, not at the moment, no.
Not at the moment? Okay. All right. So when it comes down to these particular things, the first thing that you can do is first pay attention closely to just what they're saying. If you're in, especially if you're face to face with a person, try to read their body language where possible. Once again, that goes back to that stat that we kind of talked about before, about 55% of communication being body language. I do strongly suggest that that actually is something that is crucial when it comes to this, but very much paying attention to the body language, pay attention to the inflections in their voice, their tone, and listen to what they actually have to say. The only thing I find troubling about this particular stat has to do with the 7% of the spoken word. I feel like that stat probably isn't 100% right. I feel like it's a little bit more. But either way, I definitely think that like being able to listen to this, you can start to figure out what they're actually trying to say. And then that way, while they're talking through their stuff, you can kind of determine in your head like, okay, where is the logical place that this conversation is going? And do I have something to actually add to this conversation that isn't going to degrade, but to create a situation where the person thinks about what's going on? Because really, at the end of the day, if you're trying to turn a disagreement between somebody into something that's, I guess, positive, is to make them think about a perspective. They don't have to agree with you. They just have to think about it.
Open the box a little bit.
Exactly. And so, like, when you're in this particular circumstance, one of the things that I think a lot of people could try, is you'll hear out the person, and right before it's clearly they're about to get in, like, to the roundup, whatever you would think that their conversation is going to go, you posit a couple questions that you are genuinely interested in. This is the trick, because you got to be open to new ideas that even you don't necessarily agree with. So that way you insert a question by causing the person to pause for a second and basically address your question. It can take some of the gusto out of maybe some of the emotions they're feeling, and can allow them the time to then, once they've answered your question, you can then come back with, hey, this is kind of what I was thinking about this particular thing, which is why I thought about this question. And that can then turn the disagreement / argument into a more positive or neutral conversation where you don't want to kill each other at the end. Which I think is kind of helpful. And that's where the whole strategically optimal time goes, because I really think that everybody's going to have a different pacing with who and how they conduct themselves. But as we've known from the study of children, small children, babies, can identify smiles and angry faces by simply looking at a person. We all do that instinctively. It's, subconscious. We're able to address those things in that way. And so us being able to be aware of this particular thing and be conscious of what's being said, putting this all together, can really be helpful in turning a bad conversation neutral or good. So it's something I strongly encourage. I also think that one of the other things that you can do is that don't automatically reject what the person is trying to say. Too often, and I am guilty of this as well, Well, I'll hear something and I'm like, I vehemently disagree with, and I'm like, you are wrong. Like, you are wrong, and you are wrong, and stupid for this. And like, that is just the stupidest way of conducting a true thought-provoking conversation.
And a meaningful conversation, yeah. It's just
Yeah.
like,
Yeah, because first of all, if you say a person's stupid, right, as a retort to a particular question or statement, then you are attacking the person's credibility, not what they're having to say. Another big thing that happens in that particular circumstance is the fact that because you didn't add something to the conversation, that person has either the ability to fuel the fire, further pushing their entire angry and whatever they're trying to say in one whole different direction, or it shuts down the conversation, just ends it right there. So if you are trying to communicate with people and you're trying to basically have a positive interaction, this definitely is something that you're going to want to be aware of. And yes, host, it is kind of a flashback to Control, isn't it? They are similar. So
just a wee bit.
yeah, if you want to hear a little bit more about this particular subject, go check out our Control episode. It's kind of good. It might be kind of good. You might be interested in it. Also, at this particular point, if you've watched this far, I would hope that you, if you haven't been subscribed, please do. If you are interested in supporting the channel anyway, please support us on Patreon, where we will be continually adding content, where it's actually starting again. So, like, hey. And thank you, Jackie, for supporting us on Patreon, even now. It's so wonderful. All right. And then, of course, this episode's been brought to you by Costco. The delicious water bottles. They're delicious and refreshing, and I'm going to have one now.
Was it Costco? I thought it was something else.
Oh, no, this is the Kirkland Costco brand water. Kirkland Water.
Ah.
Brought to you by Kirkland Water Streams. Of course, it's from an artificial source somewhere in the remote area of somewhere in Sacramento. Pouring it in from a tap. Anyways.
Oh boy. All right.
Anyways, so back to the topic at hand.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so obviously at this particular point, you're like, okay, cool. So I got middle ground. Okay, distracting them perhaps with something that's less contentious. Cool. That only works for some circumstances. Being able to create a strategic time by which I can talk about this. Those are all helpful, but those are only part of the tools, right? You're right, 100%. Absolutely. And so I kind of want to kind of discuss how you can pseudo-control conversations. Control the conversation. And this kind of has to do with the idea of creating intentional small bumps. So that way, instead of someone basically coming at you and counteracting whatever you have to say by slamming into you and attacking some sort of specific thing, instead slightly suggest small things that over the course of the conversation add up to the whole message. That way, it's a pill that's a lot smaller and a little easier to swallow, especially if you believe that you are right and this particular person, the goal of the conversation is to convince them of whatever you're trying to say. It's a lot better to kind of go, hey, this kind of thing is sort of supporting what I kind of think. What do you think about that? And by kind of slightly, genuinely talking about it, but not like forcing it down their throat, you're a lot more likely to be able to convince them of your side rather than beating them over the head with facts.
Ooh, that's a funny image right there.
But
no, like as soon as you started talking, my head decided to come up with the image of a person who's refusing to like eat a big meal. So instead of like taking the thing and just shoving it into their mouth for them to chew, you like cut it up into pieces and just give them a piece at a time until they're done.
I think of like feeding a toddler, we were like making like
no,
sounds and like a spoon. Yeah, I
Here
mean,
comes a
you can think of it in that particular way. I mean, I definitely wasn't thinking that then, but now I'm starting to think about it that way.
Because it's just like for some people I know, whenever they get into a disagreement with somebody, it's just like sometimes it's like arguing with a 5-year-old or younger, and I'm like, I can see it for a couple of the people you argue with, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, definitely. One of the things that I've seen is the idea of, I guess, controlling the conversation by utilizing slightly neutral tones and smaller suggestive tones. And those two ways create a type of conversation that, while a person may not agree with, they have a harder time poking holes in. And I don't know why I went there directly, but it just kind of is the thing that I think makes the most sense for this specific subject. But yeah. All right. There's a couple other things, but oh my God, host, really?
Oof. Oof, sometimes.
Oh my God. Yeah, I want to see a meme like that. That just seems like hilarious. Anyways, so one of the other things to think about also has to do with the way in which you communicate. You know, obviously we've kind of mentioned online, but I want to talk a little bit more specifically about online communication.
Mm-hmm.
Often, if you go on Twitter,
No.
which you shouldn't go on Twitter, but if you go on Twitter, it is not uncommon to find a hellacious, giant, evil mess of maddening conversations that often go in circles and or nowhere, whichever way you want to look at it. That all theoretically, if people were nicer and more civil, would change. But ways in which you can choose to engage in online conversations without them falling into, well, Twitter hell, has to do with creating certain habits. Yes, your lack of communication disturbs me. When it comes to like not responding to an email urgently, so this is going to pertain a lot to like work-based culture, but like it could pertain to friendships that are like online and other things. But often, arguments begin mostly because a person feels like, especially if it's a person feels neglected in some way, they're more likely to be a little hostile to interactions you have with that person the next time you kind of do. And so you can avoid this, of course, by, staying in contact where possible, and if they're sending emails, get back to them on time. If they send a text message, get back to them on time. Also, when you speak, choose words that are non-confrontational. Like one of the things that I struggle with often is the ability to, when I have a conversation, say a small word that doesn't sound like I'm, a nauseating asshole. And often, many times, people just get upset at me because of the words I choose to use. Mostly because they're big words and not little words. And so it creates all sorts of issues. So if you have the capacity to kind of edit the words in which you use, like you would on an online medium, then it might be better to use smaller words and concise language. So that way people are going to be less likely to spend huge amounts of time on what you have to say, which can kind of cut down the number of times in which you would potentially reach a disagreement because there's little for them to work with. And the last thing I kind of want to get to has to do with the idea of civility. When you have a conversation and you disagree with somebody, there's a saying that a lot of people will say that's pretty popular that I also enjoy, which is, I will agree to disagree with you. It does not mean that I agree with what you're saying. It doesn't mean that I disrespect what you're saying. It's just we've reached a point where it's like, okay, we're not going any further. And to some, that's good enough. To me, normally, it's good enough because I'm not going to, I'll let this person take too much more of my day. But I also understand that that can sometimes be an opening or can be considered a form of an attack. And so, what I would say in this particular circumstances is that if you disagree with somebody and it's clear that you cannot find a resolution, it is better to end the conversation in a polite way and then keep the disagreement that you have with them to yourself, unless it is absolutely necessary. That way, the person doesn't feel like that you're challenging them, and the conversation doesn't have to continue in a negative trajectory, especially if it's not going anywhere. So by being able to disconnect in that particular way, it can be helpful, which is something I think Kyle kind of does to some extent, based upon one of his earlier messages, which is good for you, Kyle. But I also think that sometimes isn't necessarily going to be helpful, especially if what you're disagreeing about is contentious about something in the workplace or like maybe like school or something like that, where you have to be where you have to find a little bit more common ground, which is why the other steps are really crucial. Yeah. Anyways, I hope that you enjoyed tonight's episode. I look forward to the call-in show next Saturday. I hope that you guys participate. Hope you guys call in.
Our Discord.
Yeah, hopefully we can have a little bit of fun questions and have some little cool, interesting, exploratory conversations. And hopefully this particular episode kind of highlights maybe how, if we disagree, you may act in the future. I hope you guys have a fantastic rest of your night. And we'll see you in the next one, you beautiful people.